Welcome to part three of lesson six of the Marxist economics section of the course. You should have already finished answering the multiple choice questions that follow each of these paragraphs. You want to pick the one that answers the question the best. We're going to go ahead and go right to the model. I'm going to place this video here, and you can play it and pause it to solve your version of the model. The dystopian economy of privilege and control in the old world. This model continues our discussion of understanding the world in which Karl Marx lived and wrote about. In the decades before the revolution, the Russian Empire was not an economy of choice but of decree. The Tsar and his ministers controlled land, labor, and production through a lattice of privileges bestowed upon noble families. So we're not talking about a free exchange economy where adults are free to buy or sell what they please with other adults with no government intervention. So this is the opposite of a free market economy. These sons and daughters of nobility held monopolies over grain mills, mines, trade routes, while peasants remained bonded to the land as serfs, compelled to labor for the benefit of their masters. Government licenses determined who could sell goods, tariffs protected aristocratic industries, and prices were fixed to preserve order rather than promote exchange. Peasants had no legal right to own property, start enterprises, or trade freely across villages. Innovation suffocated beneath layers of permission and paperwork, while production responded not to consumer needs but to official quotas. Goods were rationed, shortages were common, and surpluses often rotted in granaries because prices could not adjust. Efficiency did not exist. The economy moved only where privilege allowed. Under serfdom, the estate was the sole seller of labor in a closed and captive market. The peasant's freedom to choose employment, migrate to a town, or sell his own labor was restricted by decree. Legal codes and local officials enforced this immobility. Peasants cannot leave without a landlord's written permission, and any outside opportunity, whether in a distant workshop or nearby village, was eliminated by law. The landlord, holding exclusive control over the serf's time and output, was a monopoly supplier of labor to merchants, the crown, and the broader economy. The work of hundreds of peasants was bundled and sold through the grain they harvested, the timber they cut, and the goods they produce, while the serfs themselves received just enough to avoid starvation. Treated like equipment rather than individuals, their subsistence wage, assumed to be set at 50 rubles per year by the Tsar, just high enough to keep his serfs from revolting, could be thought of as the cost of maintenance, the economic equivalent to oiling a machine to prevent breakdown. The result is a perfectly elastic labor supply curve at the starvation wage. W equals 50 is my perfectly elastic labor supply equation. To enter this into Desmos, scroll down here and click that link to open this. Because I can't say W equals 50 in Desmos, Desmos is not an economic engine, it's a math engine. And if you want to graph a horizontal line, you have to type it as Y equals 50 rather than W equals 50. This equation here says additional labor is extracted indefinitely at the same cost because the serfs have no bargaining power, no outside options, and no legal path to freedom. The landlord's intuitive feel for the demand for his serfs' labor, the maximum value buyers are willing to pay, is modeled by this labor demand equation. I'm going to copy the numbers and the subtraction symbol and paste it between W equal and L. Now in the landlord's ledger, the revenue he earns from selling his serfs labor is the product of two simple terms: the number of laborers bundled into the package and the wage paid to each, W. So this is the landlord's revenue from the sale of his serfs. W is how much he gets paid per laborer, and this is the number of laborers he supplies. Now, he has an intuitive feel for what other firms, what the crown, what other merchants might pay for that labor, the maximum they were willing to pay at each level of L. That landlord has that intuitive fill, and that is called labor demand. W is equal to this. So we're going to replace W with what it equals inside the parentheses. And then we're going to distribute the L here to give you the linear component of revenue. Then we're going to distribute the L here to give the quadratic element in revenue. Now, over time, the landlord, though lacking any formal knowledge of economics, came to understand through trial, observation, and long experience the natural logic of his domain. By experimenting with rents, quotas, and labor intensity, often at the expense of his serfs' lives, he discovered that beyond a certain point, extracting more work produced diminishing returns. Overworked fields lost fertility, tools broke faster, and exhausted peasants became less productive, reducing future output. Through generations of estate management, a clear pattern emerged. Profits were highest when the revenue from selling one more unit of labor, marginal revenue, just balanced the cost of maintaining and controlling that labor, marginal cost. Though he would never had phrased it as profits are maximized where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, he instinctively supplied labor up to that point. No equations, graphs, or textbooks guided him. Rather, centuries of record keeping, observation, and inherited wisdom distilled into a simple rule of thumb. Push labor until any further effort costs more than it earns. This statement in economic lingo is maximize profits where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Thus, what modern economics expresses through algebra and curves evolved organically within a system built on privilege and coercion, the invisible mathematics of survival for both lord and serf. As learned in the previous lesson, differentiating total revenue with respect to labor yields the marginal revenue equation, a linear function that shares the same intercept as labor demand. My labor demand curve's intercept is the same as this landlord's intercept in its marginal revenue equation, but declines twice as steeply. So we're going to multiply the slope in the labor demand equation by 2, and we get 9.4 in my case. I'm going to enter that and make sure I get it right. Now, I've already opened this up over here. What I'll do is I'll just type a little r from marginal revenue. Marginal revenue equals 618.7, the same intercept, but 2 times the slope of labor demand. And you can see that the green line here is the marginal revenue. It and labor demand have the same intercept, and the green line is twice as steep as the black line, labor demand. With the cost of each serf being blank rubles per year, that's this labor supply equation here. Each additional laborer is paid $50. The landlord is going to increase labor, push labor, until any further effort costs more than it earns. So it's not going to go beyond this point. It's going to stop at this point. And at this point, marginal cost, which is 50 in my case, is equal to the marginal revenue, the green line, at this level of labor, 60.5. The landlord is going to supply his 6.5 serfs to merchants, the crown, and the broader economy at a total cost of what? At a total cost of 60.5 times 50, which is 3,025 rubles per set of serfs. Selling each serf's labor for 50 rubles per year, the landlord's surplus is what? I used the wrench here to stretch the x-axis so I could see the diagram better and calculate the landlord's surplus. Now, the way you got to think about the landlord's surplus is this. Suppose the serfs were not bound to the land, and the serfs each had a reservation wage of 50. They're all kind of very similar. They have the same family structure. They have the same skill set, and they would have the same reservation wage. So each of the serfs would have a reservation wage of 50. The first serf hired would have a reservation wage of 50. The last serf hired would have a reservation wage of 50. So in a perfectly competitive labor market, involving serfs who could hire their labor out to anybody, 121 of them would have been able to find work at 50 rubles per person. That's the competitive outcome. Now, at this level of employment, the last worker hired is still only earning 50 rubles. At this level of employment, that first serf hired is earning 50 rubles. Each of these serfs is getting paid the reservation wage, the market wage. So the reservation wage minus the competitive wage, 50 minus 50 is 0. And that's why serf surplus is 0. Now, we got to figure out what the landlord's surplus is. The landlord owns the serfs, but if the landlord did not own the serfs and wanted to purchase their labor to then sell to the crown, another merchant or miner, at this level of employment, they would have been willing to pay 334.35 rubles for each of those serfs. That's the most they would have been able to pay. But they only have to pay 50 because they own the serfs' labor. Again, if the serfs were able to supply their labor to whomever they wanted, as more and more and more offer their services to other landlords or other merchants or the crown, labor becomes increasingly scarce for this particular landlord. As the number of serfs dwindles, that landlord would be willing to pay more and more for that increasing scarcity of serf labor. If only 20 serfs offered their labor to this landlord, the landlord would be willing to pay at most 524.7, but because they own the serfs, they only have to pay him 50. The area under the demand curve, down to the labor supply curve, this trapezoid is the landlord's surplus. And to calculate that, we need to calculate the area of the triangle here and the area of the rectangle. Split the trapezoid into two parts. The most the landlord would be willing to pay for 60.5 laborers is 334.35 rubles. I'm going to use y equal to make a horizontal line. Then I'm going to click on the gear here, change this to black and a dash, and then a thickness of 1. So now I have this upper triangle, and I got this lower rectangle. The highest point of the triangle is 618.7. We're going to subtract off of it 334.35, this value. We're going to take that difference. That's the height of the triangle from this elevation to that elevation. The width of the triangle is the 60.5. 60.5 laborers are supplying the labor at this point, and the firm is willing to pay that much for it, but only has to pay 50. So I'm going to multiply this difference times the 60.5, and then I'm going to divide the whole thing by 2. Dividing it by 2 gives me the area of a triangle. Not dividing by 2 gives me an area of a rectangle. Now, I got to add to that the area of this rectangle. And the area of the rectangle, the highest point of the rectangle, is 334.35. The lowest point of the rectangle is 50. So I want to subtract off 50 from this. That's the height of that rectangle. The width of the rectangle is, again, 60.5. This is 0, that's 60.5. So I got to multiply that by 60.5. So when I add the 2 up, I get the landlord surplus. So I'm going to copy this and I'll paste it right here. Comparing the two, where the landlords have this incredible surplus and the serfs have no surplus, highlights the imbalance at the heart of this system. The very exploitation that ignited Marx's critique of political economy. Again, he's not critiquing an economic system where a supplier of something, labor, product, service, or information, can exchange that with a buyer of the product, service, labor, or information. He's not critiquing that world. He's critiquing this world where government has given these very few elite groups of people power and privileges over the vast majority of society. That is the world Marx is critiquing. And he called it capitalism, but I would call it something else. I would call it corporatism or state monopoly. In the Tsar's Russia, even the humble potato was not free from decree. Each spring, the Tsar's ministers issued a fixed allotment of seed potatoes to the provinces, dictating exactly how much would be planted. The yield depended not on market forces, but on the weather's mercy. A late frost or a summer drought could destroy a fifth of the crop. As a result, the supply of potatoes was fixed, determined entirely by what survived the soil, and could be represented by a vertical supply curve at the quantity harvested. So the quantity that is harvested is then taken to the market. At the moment it is at the market, that quantity is what is being supplied. Everything else is sunk. So supply, in this case, is 81 million pounds per year. Click on that to open this. I'm going to change this x equals 75 to x equal 81. Again, to draw a vertical line in Desmos, you have to use X, not Q. Desmos is a math platform, not an economics one. Yet the czar did not permit prices to rise to where supply met the following demand for potatoes. So this is the demand. I'm going to copy the numbers and the subtraction symbol and paste it right here. Instead, declaring potatoes were to be affordable for the people, he imposed the following price cap, which I'm going to type right here. Now, to impose a price cap, I need a horizontal line at the height of 9. When you want to do that, you have to use Y. So the price cap is Y equal to 9. And I'll zoom out a little bit to fit it in there. That's my price cap. I'm going to change it to, I don't know, red. Prices can't go above this red line because they're to be affordable to the people. Now, in the absence of a price cap, farmers are going to supply 81 pounds, right? The price can be anywhere along the supply curve because there's no cap. So the farmers are going to supply 81 million pounds. Russians would have demanded 81 pounds because if supply is 81 and it's a vertical line, that vertical line meets demand at this point. So the quantity demanded would have been 81 million pounds. The market clearing price is where this demand meets that supply, 27.5 kopecks per pound. Remember, a kopeck is to the ruble as a penny is to the dollar. Now, instead of doing that, the czar imposed a price ceiling of 9 kopecks. 27.5 was too much. He said, you can't charge more than 9. Let me press enter to make sure I got these all right. However, at this price ceiling, total demand rose to what? To find total demand, you want to go along this price cap of 9 kopecks and go out to the demand curve. So click on this gray dot and you get 118 million pounds of potatoes demanded at the czar's price. Now, 81 are supplied. This is creating a shortage of what? 118 minus the 81 that are supplied. Shortage is 37 million pounds of potatoes. As the wealthiest man in the empire, the czar himself would have been willing to pay up to what for a pound of potatoes? That is just the intercept of demand. The highest price that the wealthiest person would be willing to pay for a pound of potatoes. As wealth or income fall, the price they're willing to pay declines until we get to the marginal consumer, in this case, the 81st. That marginal consumer would be willing to pay $27.50 for a pound of potatoes. Poor people couldn't pay that much. So the intercept is the most the czar himself would be willing to pay for a pound of potatoes, which is 68. The nobles, aristocrats, landlords, and merchants, roughly 5% of the population, consumed a similar share of the nation's potatoes. They would have demanded about how many million pounds? They're 5% of the population, so we got to multiply the quantity supplied 5 per cent. Cent is 100. So 5% of 81 million is 4.05 million pounds of potatoes. The marginal member of that privileged class would be the one with the lowest willingness to pay for a pound of potatoes. So what we need to do here is we need to create a new line, call it x equal 4.05. Let me zoom in on that. The czar is here, and as we go down in income from the czar, we get to the marginal member of the aristocrats. And that person is willing to pay 65.975 kopecks per pound. Now, because that's a 5, I got to make that an 8. Thus, the wealthiest Russians are able and willing to pay well above the czar's official ceiling. These Russians could send their servants and stewards to purchase potatoes in the informal markets that sprang up in alleys along frozen roads. Those are black markets. The edict, intended to show compassion for the poor, produced the opposite effect. Privilege triumphed over need, and millions of peasants went hungry at the very price meant to save them. The price cap of 9 kopecks caused a shortage of potatoes equal to 37 million pounds. Bound to subsistence incomes, peasants could not afford any price above the czar's ceiling. Their consumer surplus amounted to only what? Kopecks. In the labor market, remember, they're making a wage that is just high enough to keep them from starving and revolting. So they have no ability to pay higher than the king's set price. They can pay at most 9, and that's what they get to pay in the formal markets. So their consumer surplus is 0. To calculate the consumer surplus of aristocrats, landlords, and merchants, 5% of the population, we need to calculate the area of this triangle here, and then the area of this rectangle all the way down to the king's price ceiling of 9 kopecks. So what I need to do first is I need to draw a dashed line from here to there. The most the marginal aristocrat is willing to pay is this value. So I need to type y equal that value. The most that marginal consumer amongst the aristocrats, landlords, and merchants, most that person is willing to pay is that much for a pound of potatoes. They have lots of income, so they can spend a lot more on a pound of potatoes than a serf. I'm going to change that to a black dashed line of width 1. So the first thing I need to do is I need to calculate the area of this little triangle here, which has these 3 vertices. I pulled out Notepad so I can type the formula of the triangle into Notepad. The height of this little triangle, the highest point of this triangle is 68, the czar's maximum willingness to pay. I need to subtract off it the maximum willingness to pay of the marginal aristocrat, landlord, and merchant, which is 65.975. And then the width of this triangle is the 4.05. And we can divide that by 2. That's the area of this triangle. Now I need the area of this rectangle. The rectangle is determined by these points. The height of the rectangle is a 65.975. The most the marginal aristocrat, landlord, and merchant's willing to pay. It's right here. I'm going to subtract off the price ceiling imposed by the czar, and then I'm going to multiply by the quantity of potatoes purchased by the aristocrats, landlords, and merchants, which is 4.05 million. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste it into Desmos. That's my surplus of the elites, the triangle plus this long rectangle. And I need 2 decimal places, so 0.849 becomes 0.85. I'm going to press enter to make sure I get everything right. The stark difference between the wealthiest Russians and the peasants highlights the imbalance at the heart of the system. Again, the very exploitation that ignited Marx's critique of political economy. Ironically, what Marx condemned as capitalism in his era more closely resembles what we would call corporatism, an alliance of state power and privilege that suppresses genuine market freedom rather than embodying it. And the rest of this, you want to read these paragraphs and then choose the best response for the question at the end of the paragraph.